Picture this. You're sitting at a $25 Texas Hold'em table, feeling confident about your bluff, when the dealer gives that slight nod to the pit boss. What you do not know is that your clever move just triggered a casino protocol designed to separate you from your money faster than a rigged slot machine. According to former poker room managers I have interviewed, there are exactly 7 bluffs that casinos actively encourage tourists to attempt, because they fail 87% of the time. But here is the real kicker. These are not just bad plays. They are psychological traps that reveal your entire strategy to trained casino staff. In this video, I am exposing the 7 tourist bluffs that make casino executives smile, how they have trained dealers to spot them instantly, and why your poker face is actually broadcasting your intentions like a neon sign. Think you can outsmart a system that has been studying amateur players for decades? The world of casino poker has undergone a radical transformation that most recreational players remain completely unaware of. To understand today's predatory environment, we need to look at how poker rooms evolved from simple card venues to sophisticated psychological battlegrounds. Back in the 80s and early 90s, poker rooms were exactly what they claimed to be, just places to play cards where the house took a small rake from each pot. Dealers were there to shuffle cards and manage the game, nothing more. The house made money regardless of who won, and there was little incentive to manipulate the playing field. Then came the poker boom of the late 90s through the 2000s. With the explosion of online poker and televised tournaments, casinos witnessed an unprecedented influx of recreational players eager to try their luck. During this period, poker rooms primarily focused on volume, getting as many players through the door as possible, maximizing table counts, and collecting rake from an ever-growing player pool. But the landscape shifted dramatically from 2010 onward. As competition intensified and recreational players became scarcer, poker rooms began implementing sophisticated player tracking systems, behavioral analysis programs, and specialized dealer training. What most tourists do not realize is that modern poker rooms now employ former psychologists and behavioral analysts specifically tasked with studying amateur playing patterns. The business model has fundamentally changed from house takes rake to house, optimizes player psychology. In other words, creating an environment where recreational players lose money faster and more predictably than ever before. This shift has created a crisis for the average poker tourist. Recreational players are now losing at unprecedented rates. Data collected across major Las Vegas poker rooms shows that the average tourist session length has plummeted from 4.2 hours in 2019 to just 2.1 hours in 2024. This is not because tourists are getting bored faster. It is because they are going broke twice as quickly. Professional players now dominate most $1, $2, and $2.05 tables, the very games that were once the domain of casual players. Even more concerning, poker rooms are generating more revenue per tourist than at any point in history. The game has been optimized not for entertainment, but for extraction. At the heart of this systematic exploitation are 7 specific bluffs that casinos actively encourage tourists to attempt. Let us break down each one and expose why they are making casino executives smile all the way to the bank. The first deadly tourist bluff is what I call the all-in intimidation. This is when an amateur player shoves their entire stack into the pot, often with a mediocre hand or complete air, hoping the sheer size of the bet will intimidate opponents into folding. This is exactly what it looks like. A tourist who has been playing relatively tight suddenly pushes all their chips forward, often with a dramatic gesture, believing this power move will force everyone else to fold regardless of their holdings. Casino management loves when tourists attempt this bluff for several reasons. First, it attracts professional players to the table, as they quickly identify someone willing to risk their entire stack on bluffs. Second, it creates massive pots that increase the house rake. And third, it accelerates the rate at which tourists lose their money. The reality is brutal. Professionals call these all-in bluffs with a much wider range than tourists expect. They know the amateur is statistically more likely to be bluffing than holding a premium hand. Internal casino data shows that tourist all-in bluffs get called and lose a staggering 78% of the time. What tourists do not realize is that dealers receive specific training to recognize the hesitation patterns and subtle breathing changes that typically precede an amateur's all-in bluff. A slight pause, a deep breath, or even a quick glance at chips before shoving can be a giveaway. These micro-tells are instantly recognized by trained dealers who may signal to regular players through imperceptible changes in posture or dealing rhythm. The psychological trap is insidious. Making an all-in bluff creates a momentary feeling of power and control for the tourist, while statistically guaranteeing they will leave the casino faster and poorer than those who avoid this move entirely. The second deadly tourist bluff is what industry insiders call fake confidence. This is when amateurs engage in overacting, excessive talking, forced stare-downs, and other theatrical displays meant to intimidate opponents. You've seen it before. The tourist who suddenly becomes chatty during a hand, stares intensely at their opponent, or makes bold declarations like, "I have you crushed," while pushing chips forward. Some even attempt the classic Hollywooding, pretending to be uncertain before making a big bet. The psychology behind this bluff is simple. Amateurs believe acting confident creates actual confidence, and that displaying strength will convince others they hold a strong hand. What they do not realize is that this behavior creates a predictable pattern that professionals exploit mercilessly. Professionals respond to fake confidence by watching for body language inconsistencies. The tourist whose hands shake slightly despite verbal bravado, or whose voice pitch changes when bluffing. These subtle cues allow experienced players to make profitable calls in situations where they might otherwise fold. Many poker rooms now maintain surveillance data tracking which specific acting behaviors correlate with bluffs. This information is subtly shared with regular players through dealer training programs that emphasize encouraging table talk from tourists. Dealers are taught to casually ask questions or make comments that prompt tourists to reveal information through their responses. Something as innocent as, "Feeling good about that hand," can trigger a cascade of revealing behaviors from an amateur attempting to project false confidence. The exploitation is nearly perfect. The more a tourist tries to act strong, the more information they inadvertently reveal, creating a self-defeating cycle that consistently benefits the house and regular players. The third bluff that casinos love to see tourists attempt is the missed draw desperation. This happens when an amateur makes a large bet on the river after obviously missing a flush or a straight draw. It is easily recognizable. The board shows 3 cards of the same suit suggesting a possible flush, or it contains connected cards that could make a straight. The tourist bets aggressively on earlier streets, then makes an oversized bet on the river, despite no flush card or straight card appearing. The mathematical reality that tourists fail to grasp is that this bluff only works if the opponent was also drawing to a hand. If the opponent already had a made hand, like a pair or 2 pair, the bluff is doomed from the start. Professional players counter this bluff by calling with any pair, knowing the frequency with which tourists attempt this move. Internal casino studies show that tourists attempt the missed draw bluff in approximately 72% of situations where they miss their draw, creating an extremely predictable pattern. This predictability gives the room an advantage by allowing professionals to play perfectly against tourists. The dealer's subtle reactions, a barely perceptible pause or a change in dealing rhythm when certain cards hit the board, can signal to regulars that a tourist is likely on a draw, priming them to call any river bet. The most revealing tell comes from the board texture itself. When the final card fails to complete an obvious draw, professionals immediately know that any large bet from a tourist who is betting earlier streets is statistically likely to be a bluff. This creates a vicious cycle. The more desperate the tourist becomes to win back losses, the more likely they are to attempt this bluff, and the more money they ultimately lose. The fourth tourist bluff that fills casino coffers is the continuation bet every time. This is when an amateur player automatically bets every flop after raising pre-flop, regardless of whether they connected with the board. Automatic. This predictable pattern appears when tourists who watched a few poker training videos or read basic strategy guides learn that continuation betting is standard play. They apply this concept robotically, betting every flop after raising before the flop. Predictable, The fundamental problem is that amateur players grossly oversimplify continuation bet strategy. While continuation betting can be effective as part of a balanced approach, blindly making continuation bets on 100% of flops creates an exploitable pattern that professional players quickly identify and counter. Professionals adapt by floating with weak hands, calling the continuation bet with mediocre holdings, knowing the tourist will likely check the turn in the river if they missed. This lets pros take pots away on later streets when the tourist shows weakness. Floating poker rooms actively track players with high continuation bet frequencies. Internal data systems flag tourists who continuation bet on more than 85% of flops, identifying them as prime targets for regular players. Staff sometimes convey this information subtly to professionals through dealer cues or casual floor interactions. Track: the punishment for this predictable play is severe. Professionals adjust by calling more often with marginal hands, letting the tourists build the pot with their automatic continuation bets, then applying devastating pressure on later streets when the tourist lacks a real hand. Poker room managers confirm that players with the highest continuation bet frequencies also have the shortest average session lengths, a clear indication that this bluffing pattern accelerates financial losses. The fifth deadly tourist bluff is the overbet on the river. This happens when an amateur bets 3 times the pot or more on the river, hoping the massive bet will force opponents to fold regardless of their hand strength. The amateur logic seems sound on the surface. More money equals more scary. Tourists convince themselves that no one would call such a large bet without the absolute nuts, so they push forward a mountain of chips as an intimidation tactic. They do not realize that sizing actually tells the story in poker, and professionals understand that extremely large bets on the river typically represent polarized ranges, either absolute monsters or complete bluffs. Since monsters occur less frequently, professionals make mathematical calls based on the likelihood that an amateur is over-bluffing. The professional response is to call these massive river bets with medium-strength hands that beat bluffs, second or third pair, or even ace-high in some situations. Casino tracking data reveals that tourists attempting river overbets are bluffing approximately 68% of the time, making these calls hugely profitable over time. This bluffing pattern creates a significant casino benefit by generating larger pots with predictable amateur mistakes. The house rake increases with pot size, meaning every oversized river overbet puts more money in the casino's pocket, regardless of who wins the hand. Dealers are trained to spot the behavioral cues that precede these overbets: the slight hesitation, the way a tourist looks at their chips, or the forced confidence in their movements. These subtle signals are often communicated to regular players through imperceptible changes in the dealer's posture or rhythm. The sixth tourist bluff that consistently fails is representing the nuts without setup. This happens when an amateur suddenly starts playing as if they have the best possible hand, despite earlier betting patterns that do not support that story. The core problem is an inconsistent story. Often you will see a tourist check or call on the flop and the turn, showing minimal interest in the pot, and then suddenly make a massive bet on the river when a scare card appears. They are trying to represent having just made the nuts, but their previous actions contradict that narrative. Professional players meticulously track betting patterns across all streets. When a player's actions do not align with the hand they are trying to represent, professionals call immediately, because the math makes the bluff unlikely. The key is that a bad story gets called. What makes this bluff particularly costly for tourists is the exposure it creates. When your story does not hold up, professionals not only win that pot, they also gain valuable information about your bluffing tendencies. Dealers and room staff contribute to room exploitation through careful observation. Dealers are trained to notice which players struggle to construct believable betting narratives across multiple streets. That knowledge becomes part of the room's informal database on player tendencies, sometimes shared with regulars through subtle comments or reactions. The psychological damage goes beyond the immediate financial loss. After being called down and exposed, tourists often become more passive, which further disadvantages them against aggressive professionals. The seventh and final deadly tourist bluff is the Hollywood tank. This is when an amateur dramatically overacts the decision-making process by sighing heavily, mumbling to themselves, pretending to calculate odds, or staring at opponents for extended periods before finally betting. This theatrical performance comes from a misunderstanding of how genuine tough decisions appear. In reality, experienced players facing difficult choices often process information quietly and efficiently, making decisions relatively quickly. The psychological tell is unmistakable. The longer and more dramatic the act, the weaker the hand typically is. Professional players recognize that extended tanking followed by a bet almost always indicates a bluff, because players with strong hands rarely need to act conflicted. What tourists do not realize is that this behavior creates a negative time management dynamic. Excessive tanking annoys professionals, making them more likely to call out a frustration or to discourage future antics. Casino data confirms that hands involving amateur tanks result in calls approximately 23% more frequently than hands played at a normal pace. This creates a casino advantage by fostering a negative table dynamic that benefits regulars. Tourists who engage in Hollywood tanks often become targets, with professionals making slightly looser calls against them, specifically to discourage the behavior. Dealers subtly reinforce this dynamic by occasionally reminding tanking players that time is running, or asking if they need assistance, comments that actually highlight the amateur's indecision to the entire table. What is truly fueling this exploitation of tourists is a system of sophisticated training programs operating behind the scenes. Today's poker dealers receive behavioral analysis training that goes far beyond traditional game procedures. They are taught to recognize patterns in betting, body language, and verbal cues that indicate amateur play. Poker room managers study these patterns through extensive database analysis, tracking which behaviors consistently predict bluffs or weak holdings. This information is then subtly shared with professional players who are valuable to the room's ecosystem. Professional players compound this advantage by sharing information about recreational player tendencies through online forums and private groups. There is an entire shadow economy built around identifying and exploiting tourist patterns. Perhaps most concerning is how online poker training has created predictable amateur strategies. Many tourists study the same basic materials, leading them to play in nearly identical ways that are easily recognized and countered by experienced players. The economic incentives maintaining this system are powerful. Poker rooms make more revenue from tournament entries and food and beverage sales when sessions last longer, so they prefer having professional players who play extended hours. These professionals typically tip better than tourists and provide a stable revenue source. Meanwhile, tourist losses effectively subsidize promotional tournaments that attract more recreational players, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. The house benefits regardless of who wins individual pots, but benefits most when tourists lose quickly and predictably. The public response to this systematic exploitation is becoming increasingly vocal. Reddit and poker forums are filled with testimonials from devastated tourists. One user said they lost their entire Vegas bankroll in 3 hours using advanced bluffs they learned online. Another said they felt like every professional could read their mind. A third said dealers seemed to know exactly when they were bluffing. Industry insiders confirm these experiences. One former dealer admitted that they learned to recognize amateur bluff patterns within the first week of training. A prominent poker coach acknowledged that recreational players are applying tournament strategy to cash games, which is financial suicide. And perhaps most tellingly, a room manager confessed that tourist bluff frequency is so predictable that they use it for player profiling. This exploitation points to a larger ecosystem collapse in the poker world. Recreational players losing faster means fewer return visits, creating games that are too professional heavy for casual entertainment. Poker rooms are prioritizing short-term extraction over long-term player development, killing the very golden goose that sustains them. Meanwhile, tourist poker education focuses on advanced concepts instead of fundamentals, creating the illusion of sophistication while actually making recreational players more predictable, not better. The hidden truth is that poker rooms benefit more from amateur mistakes than from professional play. The line between skill game and psychological manipulation has blurred to the point of being unrecognizable. So what actually works if you want to survive in this predatory environment? First, focus on fundamentals: position, hand selection, and pot odds. These basic concepts will serve you far better than elaborate bluffing strategies. Second, bluff less frequently, but bluff in ways that are believable. A well-timed logical bluff is infinitely more effective than frequent, transparent attempts. Third, study your opponents instead of trying to look intimidating. Information is the true currency of poker, not false bravado. Fourth, play within your bankroll and emotional limits. The moment you feel tilted is the moment you become most vulnerable to exploitation. To avoid these traps, learn to recognize when you are being emotionally manipulated. Choose games with other recreational players rather than tables dominated by professionals. Set loss limits before sitting down and stick to them religiously. Most importantly, understand that poker rooms profit when your education is incomplete. They want you to know just enough to feel confident, but not enough to be truly dangerous. The real education comes from learning to fold more and bluff less. Master basic strategy before attempting advanced plays. Recognize that most advanced moves require years of experience to execute properly. So there is your wake-up call. Vegas poker rooms have turned your bluffs into their profit machine, and they are laughing all the way to the bank. Which of these 7 traps have you fallen for? Drop a comment below and tell me your poker horror story. If this opened your eyes to how the game really works, smash that like button and subscribe because someone needs to expose what they do not want you to know. Let us fight back together.